Despite largely conducting their lives within the bounds of a traditional agrarian society, the classical Greeks were responsible for creating a series of world-changing innovations. Early in the period of their efflorescence, they invented the alphabet by borrowing and adapting letter forms used in the Near Eastern nation of Phoenicia, and the Greek alphabet, as further adapted by the Romans, has been central to communication ever since. They went on to invent philosophy, logic, rhetoric, and mathematical proof, to be the first practitioners of theatrical drama, rational medicine, monetary coinage, and lifelike sculpture, and to create competitive athletics, architectural canons, the self-governing city-state, polis, and democratic politics. These transformative cultural changes, which took place over the 5 centuries from 800 to 300 BCE, cannot have happened by accident. None of the Greeks' creations, nor the products thereof, some of which have never been surpassed, could have come into being without the contributions of individuals who created and operated in conditions fertile for change, who were prepared and keen to innovate, and who understood how to exploit the means of doing so. Some Greeks also sought to understand the conditions that made innovation possible, and descriptions of the creative procedures that led to many of the Greeks' novel achievements are preserved in their writings. What surviving texts illustrate is that, while the processes of creativity are potentially endless, the creation of the new relies on a few basic principles, notably the adaptation of existing elements, the cross-fertilization of disparate entities, and the disruption of previous conditions. On these principles and combinations of them, change was created in practice for centuries. It inspired the earliest Greek thinkers from the 6th century BCE to ask questions such as, where does everything come from, and what is change? Toward the end of the classical period, Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, sought to analyze the logic of change on different levels: natural, metaphysical, and political. Aristotle's theoretical analysis of change in Physics, Book 1, begins by refuting the counterintuitive notion proposed by predecessors such as Parmenides that change itself is impossible. He goes on to argue that all change requires a pre-existing situation or substrate from which change can and must proceed. His argument may be generalized to affirm that the new depends on the old, a position summarized in Physics Book 1. Aristotle was keen to understand change in practice as well as in theory. The key political unit of the Greek world of his time was the polis, independent citizen-run state. Around 1,000 existed in the classical period. How the polis might best be organized is the focus of the philosopher's discussion in his Politics Book 2. There, Aristotle discusses and critiques the governments of some existing states, and considers blueprints for new kinds of government, such as those proposed by Socrates in Plato's Republic, and Plato in his Laws, as well as examining the innovative constitutional proposals of less well-known political theorists. The novelty in thought and action generated by the Greek city-states of classical times laid the basis for the artistic, intellectual, and scientific discoveries, some 2 millennia later, of the European Renaissance. Writers and artists in that period of rebirth supposed that they were engaged in a recreation of Greek ideas in science, art, music, and many other fields. A large part of the education offered in Renaissance universities involved the interpretation of Aristotle's works and the study of his ancient commentators. It made sense for thinkers then, and it still makes sense today, to look to the great philosopher of antiquity to deepen our understanding about, among other things, the principles of change. The 2 longest texts chosen for this book, taken from Aristotle's Physics 1 and Politics 2, to accompany the first and last chapters, respectively present the philosopher's closely argued theoretical analysis of change and his extensive criticisms of proposals for innovation in the sphere of politics. Aristotle's discussion of the logic of change and variation in physics argues that change can be understood only in relation to a persistent underlying element. His treatment of constitutions in Politics, too, considers in detail and levels criticisms at existing forms of government and at theoretical attempts to devise new kinds of government for the polis. It concludes with a brief but important observation that the value of innovation differs depending on the domain in which it is applied.